Martin, I think we better start with this attack, the Manchester Arena attack. I mean, what's your general take-home from what happened that day?
Well, I think the most significant thing that people haven't really picked up on, or they ought to pick up on, is that the Islamic Fighting Group of Libya, or the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, basically were headquartered in Manchester during the 1980s when they were being shipped to Afghanistan to fight the Red Army, having been trained basically by our own intelligence services and special forces.
In what way were they related to Libya then?
Well, because
they're going over to Afghanistan.
Well, the bomber, the alleged bomber, if we can call him that, was a member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, as was his father, who made a statement in Tripoli about what had happened, saying that the whole thing was a set-up and that the whole thing was being orchestrated from inside the Western intelligence services. Now, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group is very significant because the Libyans provided by far the largest...
You're talking about Ramadan Abadi, yeah? This is the guy who was in the Islamic Fighting Group. We know he was working for MI6, so it's not really much of an excuse to have an MI6 agent and his son carries out a bombing, and the intelligence services are telling us they didn't know anything about it.
Well, I mean, what the father was saying before he was disappeared, and we don't know where, I'm not quite sure what's happened to him, is that he was in the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. He'd been working, because they've been working intimately with MI6 for years and years and years, going back to the 1980s, both in opposition to Gaddafi and, of course, operating in Afghanistan in the 80s. And, of course, lots of them were then transferred to Syria after Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya. And people have got to know the background and the history. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group are Al-Qaeda Libya, but they have an intimate relationship with MI6 and, of course, with MI5 indirectly. So the idea that these people are just random is just wrong. They are there, based in Manchester, because Manchester was basically made as the ex-Libyan place where they were going to be. So all these people from Libya lived in Manchester with the full understanding of the Western intelligence services, particularly our own in Britain.
Well, he was detained by the militia, Ramadan Abadi, Salman Abadi's father, not been heard of since.
Well, indeed, and of course he was saying that the whole thing is actually orchestrated, because he's an insider. He's a Libyan Islamic Fighting Group guy, and he also works with MI6, and he immediately pointed the finger at MI6 as being behind the bombing. So when we're talking about MI5 being lacking in capacity to stop bombs and all the rest of it, you're missing the point. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group is a terrorist organisation, but it's been set up, run and directed by MI6 since the 1980s. So we're talking 50 years of relations with MI6.
So is there actually any evidence that Salman Abadi, CCTV, that sort of thing, was even at the Manchester Arena?
Well, these questions start to emerge, don't they? What actually happened here?
Well, the answer is no. What the security services have released are several pictures with all of the edges blacked out. So it's a picture of Salman Abadi with a suitcase of some sort, and all you can see around the edges is black. So it doesn't actually show any evidence that he was there.
Unless you've got a time-stamped video, then it doesn't mean anything.
These were taken apparently in a lift in the centre, but they blacked everything else out because they didn't want to show other people's faces.
Well, unless you've got a time-stamped video, it doesn't mean anything, does it? I mean, people think they saw the bombers on 7/7 on video, but it was from the dry run the previous week.
There was nothing shown around the Salman Abadi's body other than black, so you couldn't see anyone else's, not even parts of a lift. It was really impossible to see where he was.
Well, it may well be that the whole thing is a false flag terrorist attack, or it may be blowback. You know, you could argue, I think people on RT have argued that basically you shouldn't have been in bed with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Looks what happens when you work with these kind of people. They were anti-Gaddafi, they were anti-Russian, therefore they were on our side even though they were Al-Qaeda. But of course it could be blowback, but I think it's more suspicious than that. Orchestrating the whole of the strategy of tension before 9/11 and after 9/11 has been Western intelligence services, in which MI6 are big players. They're as big players in many ways as the CIA.
But that's
and Mossad.
ridiculous. I mean, surely our own security services wouldn't get involved in an attack which killed 22 of our own people.
They would if it then led to a situation where everybody's screaming, oh, we're being bombed here, give some more resources to the security services, they can carry on doing other things elsewhere. Don't forget that the purpose of all of this is to carry on wars in the Middle East and elsewhere for resources. And the 9/11 attack itself looks like a false flag. The bombing of Bologna railway station in 1980 was a false flag. The bombs in Dublin and Monaghan in 1972 were false flag, according to the Italian and Irish police in both cases. Now, in actual fact, unless you know the history of Western intelligence service false flag terrorism, you might say, surely the intelligence services are trying to catch the bombers. Not necessarily. Not necessarily at all.
Well, there was a whole list of problems with, and it'd be interesting to see, what the Intelligence and Security Committee say about any of these, and we'll come to that in a minute. But we had helplines inoperative. Actually, that day, there was supposed to be an automatic helpline, but it didn't give any useful information. And since Vodafone have apologised to the Home Office and saying, well, we thought we were going to have a helpline, it was supposed to be ready, but unfortunately on the night of the attack and the next day it didn't work.
Well, interestingly enough, the fire brigade are also complaining because they weren't given access to the scene. Now, that possibly means that somebody is cleaning the scene to make sure that outsiders can't see what's actually happened.
Is that there was supposed to be another bomber or something, so the fire brigade were told, hang on a minute, just stay back and don't come near the attack scene. Also, another thing which happens often is these false alarm of second terrorists, giving the police and private security total control of the terror attack crime scene, which is what you've just said there. Key eyewitnesses are not interviewed, or frozen out, or neglected. Now, we heard, didn't we, from Dawn Waddy, who said that she saw a very suspicious woman who wasn't actually who was at the concert sitting next to her but wasn't paying any attention to it and kept looking at where the bomb eventually went off. She had a rucksack that she kept fiddling with, and she wasn't actually watching the concert. She had no interest in it, and she had some sort of foreign accent.
Well, I would make the point, fundamental point, that we've got overwhelming evidence from the past that NATO intelligence services have engaged in terrorist provocations.
So what about the security people
on this
who are
occasion,
in charge? I mean, are they I mean, it does seem that they ignored warnings. Private security at the arena could actually be potentially a terror vector.
Well, indeed, as when you've privatised security in things like airports, ICTS, an Israeli firm connected to Mossad, controlled all 3 airports on 9/11, where hijackers supposedly got on planes, and also controls Schiphol Airport today, where the underpants bomber and the shoe bomber were both allowed on the plane without being checked. Now, in actual fact, most terrorism is orchestrated by security forces. Some of it is random, but most of it isn't.
Salman Abedi, who's the alleged bomber, I would suggest most likely patsy for this attack. He was reported to the anti-terror hotline several times, apparently, and he was well known, obviously, to the security services through his father working for them, and yet there was nothing done to stop him.
Well, what you need to do
what's the point of phoning the anti-terror hotline about somebody who's about to carry out a terrorist attack?
I would suggest to anybody listening to this show, and the point I made in Birmingham Central Mosque some years ago, is if you suspect somebody is a terrorist, you shouldn't contact the anti-terror hotline. You should contact the local police, because they can then filter what's going on. The fact of the matter is, I'm afraid, that intelligence services, the higher up you go, are suspects. And therefore you shouldn't be working directly with them. We'll be coming
to that in a minute. So basically, phone 101, folks. Don't phone the anti-terror hotline.
Quite.
Rather, potentially anyway, a waste of time. Anyway, somebody who was really irritated about this whole business, he was severely injured in the attack. His name's Robbie Potter, and he thinks that MI5 should be sued over the revelations, that they knew so much and been following this guy, and he had so many connections and they've been warned so many times. He's wondering what on earth is the point of MI5. But anyway, he's saying they should be taken to court. And here he is speaking to the BBC's Judith Moritz.
Abedi was never referred to the government's anti-radicalisation programme, Prevent, and was able to visit another extremist in prison. Robbie Potter was gravely injured in the attack, left in a coma with shrapnel removed from his heart. Today, he's on the mend, but angry at the revelations.
This is something that could have been stopped. End of. This did not have to happen. Every alarm bell was ringing.
You feel let down?
I am a bit, yeah. There was enough warning signs. It wasn't just like one hoax call to him. There's enough warning signs. They should be took to court. Yeah, I've said it. They should be took to court now. They're just as guilty. That could have been stopped.
MI5?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's an absolutely fair comment from that gentleman. But I come back to what we were saying earlier. The real problem is that the intelligence structure is implicated in Islamist terrorism and has been since the 1980s.
But what Robbie Potter is saying there is this attack could have been stopped and should have been stopped. So why wasn't it? I mean, what we have what we have with the security services, Martin, is a whole bunch of secret officers who are able to be interviewed by the Intelligence and Security Committee behind closed doors, but it's all totally anonymous and they don't face prosecution. We also saw a story earlier on this year which said that the MI5 are actually allowed to break the law and commit crimes with impunity.
Well, and anybody thought that anything else was the case, I've got a suspension bridge to tell you. The Western intelligence services, including MI6, the CIA, etc., are extremely iffy organisations. They always have been. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group is based in Manchester because MI6 based them there in the 1980s. And that, what are we on now? 2018? That's nearly 50 years ago. And they've been working with them very closely all that time, which is why they know everything about this guy, and they didn't stop it because they didn't want to stop it. So and it's not even clear he did it, as you said earlier.
The story is in The Guardian from the 2nd of March this year. MI5 agents can commit crimes in the UK, the government reveals, and officers obviously as well. Secret order on authorised criminality by spies has been made public after a legal battle by rights groups. MI5 officers are allowed to carry out criminal activity, the government's acknowledged for the first time. The Prime Minister on Thursday was forced to publish the text of a direction to the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, the spying watchdog, on governing security service participation in criminality. It instructs the IPCO to oversee the participation of MI5 agents in criminal activity, which was previously conducted by the now defunct Office of the Intelligence Services Commissioner under a secret order referred to as the Third Direction.
Well, the fact is that they've been engaged in criminal activities for years.
And I'll put that
it's hardly surprising. This is just a bit of an admission.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it?
New was the case in the book.
I'll put a link up to that on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. But anyway, let's hear from the Home Affairs correspondent of the BBC, Dominic Cacciani. I suppose before that, we should give a kind of, a warning, really, saying, well, take this with a pinch of salt. After we spoke to the former Special Branch Officer and Army Officer Charles Shoebridge, Martin, who said that actually the London media's Home Affairs correspondents are basically press officers for MI5.
That's right, that's total integration.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, you don't end up being in that position if you're going to be problematic from the point of view of the securocrats that run things.
OK, so problematic. Let's have a listen to Dominic Cacciani now on BBC's 5 Live yesterday.
What the Intelligence and Security Committee has said today very explicitly is that, in their view, MI5 has admitted that it made a mistake in not tracking Salman Abedi in the Manchester bomb. And let me just take you back a little bit, because I think there's a bit of history around the Abedi case. He was initially a person of concern to MI5. That he first came onto their radar in 2014 when they received some intelligence which suggested that the then teenager was of a cause of concern. They had a look at him. They decided actually that at that time he wasn't at the threshold to be some kind of potential terrorist in the making. That happens with an awful lot of people who come across MI5's radar. So they, in their view, they can't justify spending any more time on that individual because there are, to be frank, bigger fish to fry. What then happened, I think, is very, very interesting. They started to receive bits and pieces of possible intelligence in relation to Salman Abedi, and a decision was taken to review his case about whether or not effectively to reopen his file and turn him into one of their priority cases to look at. But the review meeting, which would have taken that decision, wasn't actually scheduled until actually after the bombing took place. And critically, Abedi, who's believed to have received his bomb-making training from Islamic State or another group in Libya, he flew back into the country days before the attack. There was no flag against him so that he would be stopped at the airport and questioned and his devices cloned and examined. So there was a potential opportunity missed there. The security service have effectively conceded, say, MPs, that port stop probably should have been in place. Now, whether or not it would have stopped an attack, given how close it was a matter of days later that he built his bomb and carried out his attack. We don't know. But another key piece of the picture, which became much clearer today, is the fact that Abedi We knew already that he had visited a known jailed extremist in prison in the UK, a guy from Manchester called Abdul Rauf Abdallah, and the committee makes clear today that visit was not passed on to the security service, MI5. They weren't aware that visit took place. And
I mean, one does wonder what MI5 get up to, and they seem to know so little about somebody like this. Martin, the other thing here is they're now saying that he was the bomb maker, although in the beginning, certainly for the first few months, there was no idea that he had any kind of bomb-making skills whatsoever, and that someone else must have been involved. But this is all very convenient, because the person who's now supposed to have been the bomb maker, making a bomb within just a couple of days of coming into the UK and exploding it, is dead.
Well, indeed. And, of course, it just raises more questions than answers, does it not? I would suggest that a bomb like that is unlikely to have been made by an individual. It's quite likely that there was a group involved. But if there's a group involved, then the explanation that we've been given about what happened doesn't stack up. And I come back to what I was saying earlier. My suspicion is that behind not just this attack, but the 7/7 attack and certainly the 9/11 attack and many other of these attacks, they're being orchestrated from within the Western intelligence services. And I know some people may be shocked to hear that, but they shouldn't be, because the reality is that's what's been going on for over 50 years.
Martin, there was also a Parsons Green attack. That was the last year too. The MI5 only delivered all their papers that the Intelligence and Security Committee had been wanting yesterday. So the same day as they were supposed to be, these MPs were supposed to be telling us all about what happened on the Parsons Green attack, that's when this massive box of paperwork arrived from MI5. It doesn't sound as if they're actually cooperating with the members of Parliament.
No, and you could argue, I mean, you know, on one level it sounds as if they're trying to cover up the fact that they're incompetent and they didn't catch people and so on and so forth. But I think it's more sinister than that, frankly. If you know the history of their relationship with Al-Qaeda, with the Islamic fighting group in Libya and others, and what's been going on in Syria over the last 5 or 6 years, where it's absolutely clear that British special forces have been cooperating with Islamist terrorists to carry out bomb attacks of various kinds. And that's what we pay our taxes for, folks. Don't kid yourself. That's the real world.
Well, let's try and dig into a bit more behind this screen that's put up by the Intelligence and Security Committee, basically saying things like, well, they've got MI5 had bigger fish to fry than Salman Abedi, even though he was about to blow up this bomb, and allegedly, anyway, and possibly just be the patsy for someone else that did it, and that his father was working for MI6. So let's have a listen now to Alex Thompson, who's a former GCHQ officer. We had him on this programme, must be 4 or 5 months ago now, with quite a fascinating look at the privatisation of GCHQ and the intelligence services. And here he's talking to us about intelligence whistleblowers and what they tell us about what's really going on behind the scenes, that the Intelligence and Security Committee MPs have not managed to get any information from MI5 and the rest of them about at all.
Spycatcher by Peter Wright. I'm sure you know all the hoo-ha about that. It was published in the US. He went to live in Australia. He was the number 2 of MI5. He came up through the scientific route. He was not a public school boy. And he could see some things clearer than the old boys' tie network. But he couldn't quite conceive of the City of London and secular Zionism being the thievery, the heart of thievery involved. So there's a key point on page 317 where the absolute A1 Soviet defector Anatoly Golitsyn, who tells us all about the long-range planning for the Soviets to survive the collapse of their territorial empire and to go into the West in the minds of men, Golitsyn has revealed all this, and Wright, who's number 2 at MI5, has the privilege of debriefing him and seeing him in person and waving photos in front of him and saying, "Do you remember this guy?" He leaves him, after much internal debate, with MI5's files on who might have been the MI5 mole who was giving stuff away to the Soviets. And Golitsyn thinks and thinks, and then he comes back and says, "Your spies, Mr. Wright, are here. My methodology has uncovered them," he intoned darkly, pointing his finger like the witch finder at 2 files on the table in front of him. I knew the files well. They belonged to Victor Rothschild and Tess Rothschild. "Don't be totally absurd, Anatole," I said. "Victor is one of the best friends MI5 has ever had. How on earth did you jump to that conclusion?" He's not prepared to accept what Golitsyn, the best ever defector, is telling us. This one's in German, Die Deutsche Karte, which means playing the German card. written by a chap who died earlier this year, Hans-Gerd Komosa, who was head of German military intelligence in the late Cold War. And the key point for him, I won't read this out, it's in German, but the key point is he's got a paragraph about Sir Stuart Mingus, the wartime head of MI6, and he's got an anecdote I've never found in English, which is that during the war, King George VI calls him over and says, "Mingus, what would happen if I were to ask you the name of our man in Berlin?" Mingus answered, "I would have to tell you, sire, that my lips are sealed." Very good, Mingus. And imagine that I then followed that up by saying, "Off with his head." In that case, Your Majesty, my head would roll with my lips still sealed. So this is treason, okay? This is a bunch of people who've taken over under the sovereign, who are saying to the sovereign, stuff you don't get read into our intelligence world. It's not there for you, it's for a corporate group. Okay? So the evidence has been there through the decades by these intelligence whistleblowers that there has been an internal cabal which is vaguely overlapping with Britain and America, Israel and South Africa, but which is not in the service of the national interest or the people or the parliaments of any of those nations. There's no oversight of it. And they have formed basically an intelligence-sucking mass which is going to be put at the service of the emerging, supposedly EU, but really global corporate shock troops.
So that's Alex Thompson. He's a columnist, a regular appearance on something called the UK Column, run by Brian Gerrish, I think out of Plymouth. But Martin, what he's saying there is that actually the intelligence services have arranged themselves so nicely that actually they're far, far closer to the City of London. And he mentioned Tess Rothschild and Victor Rothschild there, far closer to the City of London than they are to any kind of scrutiny by the royals or by our MPs.
Well, of course. I mean, it strikes me as, why is anybody surprised by this? What do you imagine goes on in the real world? In the real world, powerful oligarchs suborn the institutions of the state to do what they want to do. They've been doing it for years. They're still doing it. And the idea that somehow these organisations are there to serve the people or even to serve the Queen is laughable. They're just not there for that. That's not what they're about. The Hambros Bank in the City of London was packed with ex-MI6 people. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which collapsed in the 90s, I think it was, CIA front organisation all the way. The Nugent Hand Bank in Australia, basically a intelligence service bank. So the intelligence services and the bankers are the same people. It's a revolving door, and that's what they do. They revolve.
So what's the point in having an Intelligence and Security Committee then?
For show, Tony. For show. The pretence that something is actually a constitutional structure under some kind of constitutional control, when in actual fact it isn't anything of the kind.
50 people dying, 22 people in Manchester. How many innocent British people have to die before we get some changes and any kind of proper scrutiny of the intelligence and services? I mean, we're talking particularly here about MI5, who is actually their job to stop this kind of thing.
Well, ultimately, all of these organisations, all of these organisations will ultimately have to be disbanded.
Martin, Robbie Potter wants to take them to court. Is that feasible?
I can see why he's saying that, but that might be one line of attack to chip away at them, if you see what I mean.
They always appear behind screens, don't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, as Colonel J appeared behind a screen in Northern Ireland, it turned out in the end that he was Brigadier Gordon Kerr, and he was in fact running the UDA's Chief Intelligence Officer Brian Nelson as one of his agents, and therefore orchestrating the UDA's terror campaign which killed hundreds of people. But has he been punished? No, he hasn't. There's a panorama programme by John Ware about him, and he was doorstepped in Beijing, but no doubt he's living somewhere high on the hog as a pensioner of the British state, even though it's pretty clear that he's a terrorist.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
I suppose we really ought to do this is looking at some of the manoeuvrings behind the scenes, potentially anyway, the people that are really controlling things, because we certainly don't seem to be getting much use from people like the Intelligence and Security Committee and the Prime Minister. And this is a chap called Joseph Wages. He's a Freemason himself, but he believes that there are Freemasons out there and people involved with Freemasonry, and not necessarily just that, other cults as well, because Freemasonry is a religious cult, who deliberately deliberately attempt to infiltrate politics and then to control things from behind the scenes. So let's see what Joseph Wages has to say.
In the actual Minerval degree, Illuminatus minor degree, Scottish novice, Scottish knight, the oaths that they're really swearing is that they're going to maintain inviolable secrecy. So the only ones that have like the so-called death penalty are the ones in the Masonic degrees itself, but those aren't unique to the Illuminati. They're kind of patterned off of Freemasonry. So if we look at it from a larger perspective, they're using Freemasonry as a vehicle for expansion. So the Illuminati's like subversion is less to do with civil society and more to do with Freemasonry. And I'm not saying that there's not a push towards global governance. You'd be a fool to say the opposite of that. And the ultimate idea is to impact and change the world for the better. So they're not advocating for the violent overthrow of governments per se, but what they're advocating for is the influence of government. So one of the things they say several times in the rituals is that, you can overthrow a government and you'll get no change for the better, and more than likely than not, the change for the worse. So the idea is for the heads of state, whether they be dukes or kings or princes or so forth, is to surround them with advisors educated in their system to prevent these people from making the wrong decisions or doing things that are, not in the interest of the society and are, maybe motivated by their own interest.
Well, there's a certain amount of sense in that, Martin, isn't there? Because if you have a revolution, you really don't know who's going to come out on top. Anybody could.
Well, I mean, and there's different kinds of meaning of the word revolution as well. I mean, change is obviously always going to be problematic when you've got powerful groups who want to steer everything in their own interests.
Anyway, there's a chap called David Livingston. We had a clip from him a few weeks ago. He's got a new book coming out soon called Ordo Ab Chao, means order from chaos. And he's also a big believer, as I am, in the potential, anyway, for secret societies to be running things from behind the scenes. And this latest book is, as he's a convert to Islam, and he sees the Islam as the main target of these groups.
What they're trying to do is fulfill the Book of Revelation, right? So you and I, or most people would read it and see the predictions as terrible things to happen. But since these guys are Luciferians, they see it backwards. So that's why it's a blueprint. So they believe that they need to fulfill the chaos that is prophesied in the Book of Revelation in order to accelerate the coming of the Messiah. And this is stated almost verbatim or explicitly by Alexander Dugin, who is really the architect of the Russian influence campaign in the United States. And he basically says exactly that the Book of Revelation is not, he says it's a task. It's a responsibility. And so they don't see, creating wars and destruction, famine, disease as a problem. They see it as a requirement, that it's all part of the necessary stages that have to happen to bring about the coming of the Messiah. Their Messiah, so it's the Antichrist.
So, I mean, is it potential, Martin, that even though these things are sort of prophesied in the Book of Revelation, that people are looking at that book and saying, actually, that would be good, let's make this happen?
Well, there are people out there who take the Book of Revelation literally and are trying to implement it. I mean, the Christian Zionists in the US believe that they support Israel because they believe that there's going to be a final war, and then the Jews are going to convert to Christianity and the Messiah will come. But those people are not. Those people are not the generals in charge of the fighting.
They see that as a good thing. It's incredible.
Indeed, they do, because that's the kind of thinking that you get when you believe in prophecy from books written in the Bronze Age.
That would explain why that they don't want to negotiate with Iran, for example.
Well, indeed, because in actual fact they want a conflict. But whether they're the ones who are actually calling the shots is another matter. I think the people calling the shots are cynical, self-centred oligarchs. And they want what they want, and they use all of this other stuff as a load of flim-flam to keep the masses where they want them.
Okay, finally tonight, let's go back to have a listen to William Stewart, who we heard a couple of weeks ago, and his thoughts on the